From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, and welcome to Wartime Journalists here at the Veterans History Project. I am Donald Scott, the Deputy Librarian of Congress, and I want to say to you that though this is the last session for Wartime Journalists and Stories, it does not mean it's the last effort we'll make to collect the stories of veterans. I also want to take this opportunity to let you know that we are blessed today and honored to have one of the two members of Congress who actually started this Veterans History Project. And it was back in the year 2000, and Representative Ron Kine, along with Representative Amo Howell, were the two from the House who put in legislation to have a nationwide effort to capture the stories of veterans who served in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf Wars. And so I wanted you to know that your members of Congress are always thinking about what is important for America, and I think you would agree that the Veterans History Project, along with the establishment of the World War II Memorial, is one of the better things that this Congress has ever done for this country. So would you please, warm welcome to Representative Brooks.
Well, thanks so much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're delighted that you're here. This is a very important session. Not only are we going to be listening to people who really ran the journalism during the war, but also it's the plea that if you have stories, please tell them. Let me tell you my story. I had a father who was in World War I, and I never had any bit of his story put on paper. And I finally got one of those Sony video cameras, and literally 6 months before he died, I got him to talk about his experiences in World War I. I don't know why he did it. It just happened. It was just happenstance. We're going to have to do that on a more regular basis. There are extraordinary stories to be told, not only for you to get them out, to share them, but also for future generations. So thank you very much for being here. Keep that in mind, and there will be other opportunities to tell your stories. What I'd like to do is to introduce my co-moderator, Sandra Johns, and the whole subject, as you know, is covering the war, wartime journalism. Sandra is really some person. She is now one of the two Pentagon reporters for Stars and Stripes. She's traveled all over the world, from Iraq to Haiti to Guantanamo Bay to Bosnia to Croatia. She grew up in the military. Her father was in the Navy, I think, Sandra, for 30 years. And so she knows all about this subject, and she will kick this thing off, and then we'll introduce the individuals here, and then ultimately we'll take questions from the audience. Sandra, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Again, thank you so very much for coming. As the representative has said, it's so important for us to get these stories, to listen to them, to hear them, and to document them. And we've got a rare opportunity this afternoon to listen to two of the stories firsthand. I'd like to introduce retired Army Colonel Peter Swears, Jr. And just so that I get it correct, I'm going to read his little bio here. He was born in Chicago, Illinois, and he joined the Army in 1942. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Coast Artillery Corps in 1943, and then served 2 years in Europe, participating in 6 major campaigns from late January 44 until November of 1945. Following World War II, he was the OIC of Armed Forces Radio in Okinawa and served for 3 years as the Chief Information Officer at the Pentagon. He is also a veteran of Korea and the Vietnam Wars. His last assignment before retiring from the Army in late 1969 was editor-in-chief of Stars and Stripes. During the Vietnam conflict, he was there for 67, 68, and 69. And the paper at the time had a circulation reaching a peak of 300,000. Since leaving the military service, Colonel Swears has been an assistant superintendent and labor relations director for the school districts in the Los Angeles area and an associate professor of journalism at Murray State University and vice president of public relations at Gonzaga University in Washington State. His last management position was employee relations manager for Peterbilt Motors division in California. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to have been selected to participate in the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project and to be included with the many veterans attending the emotional dedication of the World War II Memorial. In 1942, as Sandra said, I joined the United States Army, and in early '43, I was commissioned as second lieutenant in the Coast Artillery Corps, later known as Anti-Aircraft Artillery and now known as the Air Defense Artillery. 62 years ago, at the age of 20, it's very difficult to comprehend the danger and excitement of combat. I served 2 years in Europe and participated in the major campaigns in Germany, France, Belgium, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. Many dangerous times and many happy memories. For almost 2 years, I can recall several exciting events. Several impressed this then 21-year-old lieutenant. We entered Normandy with Patton's Third Army. However, while defending Paris, we were ordered on the 3rd of November to proceed immediately to Antwerp. The story I'm going to tell you is very little known, but a very important part of World War II. We were ordered to set up a defense against the piloted aircraft, or V-1s, a few weeks earlier. A few weeks prior to that, Field Marshal Montgomery, the British 11th Armored Division, captured Antwerp. It was the largest port in Europe, and it was a prize and a stroke of good fortune. The Allies were hard-pressed for the vital flow of supplies. The retreating Germans had destroyed every port in France along the coast, and with winter coming, the improvised ports would gradually be put out of action. Intelligence told us that the Germans would make an all-out effort with the V-1s to destroy Antwerp and this port. And as we all know here, they tried again during what is known as the Battle of the Bulge. This was a secret command known as Antwerp X. It was commanded by Brigadier General Claire Armstrong, who was the United States military class of 1917, who taught this young lieutenant a lot. In the next several months, 4,883 V-1s were launched at Antwerp. By the 15th of November, our brigade had 4 groups and 15 battalions of 90-millimeter guns. During this 154-day attack, I was the operations officer at the command headquarters, working all night to provide early warning to our gunners without stop. Our command post was teeming with activity. We were on the alert for enemy parachutists, and a new problem. General von Rundstedt was moving, and the German panzers were now just 74 miles from Antwerp and our headquarters. Montgomery, Field Marshal Montgomery, was short of anti-tank weapons, and he asked for our 90 millimeter guns. We sent 7 battalions of 90 millimeters, trucks and men, to the Field Marshal Montgomery's defenses. And prior to the Battle of the Bulge, the Luftwaffe, believe it or not, attacked, and we destroyed 6 Nazi planes and damaged several others in February. In late February, it finally ended. Only 211 missiles penetrated the defense, and 2,394 missiles, as you can tell I did my homework last night, would have hit the port if not engaged. Our nerves were on edge. The constant roar of artillery, day and night, continuous earth-shaking concussions as V-1s we missed hit the earth all around us. Hard to sleep, busy, lousy cold, and snow. Few ever heard about this great success because Antwerp X and its mission were kept secret until the latter part of April 1945. Field Marshal Montgomery, in April of 1945, stated, and I quote, "The success of the gunners of the 50th Brigade has kept in full operation the port of Antwerp, the main supply base of the 12th and 21st Army groups." As you all know, the 12th group was General Omar Bradley's group. The results have been achieved only by continuous day and night firing and continuous moving of units back and forth as we adjusted the units to where the missiles were coming from. I wish to, this is Montgomery continuing, congratulate all ranks upon the success of this major operation. Then in the latter part of July, prior to the defense of Antwerp, our brigade moved to a few miles south of Saint-Malo, which had stubbornly held out. We shelled Saint-Malo day and night, and when Saint-Malo finally fell 2 weeks later, the surrender of the mad colonel, German, of the Saint-Malo citadel was dead, and however the port was determined to be destroyed and no longer able. Now, fortunately, we all are limited in time, or I would continue another eventful episodes, but I'd like to turn it back.
Thanks very much. Now we're going to turn to Barrett McGurn. Barrett is a very famous man. He's just written a book. You can get some pamphlets over here. Yank, the Army Weekly, and he'll tell you all about it. But Barrett was a 20-year war correspondent in Europe and North Africa and Asia. He was a South Pacific war correspondent. Before Yank, he was wounded in Bougainville, received a Purple Heart Military Commendation Medal. And furthermore, and more importantly, he soon is to be the ripe old age of 90 years old. Is that right? So let me introduce you to Barrett McGurn.
I thank you all for being here today to commemorate the war correspondents of World War II.
Little closer.
I was a correspondent.
A little closer, yeah.
I was a correspondent for Yank magazine, which was almost unknown to the civilian population during World War II because we were an internal Army publication. But I don't know how many of you remember Yank, but every fourth person in the armed forces did read our magazine. We were something unique in military history and in journalism history in a way too, because we were the first global publication. When World War II started, a few fellows who had been on Stars and Stripes in 1918 said that during the new war spread all over the world, we would have to have a magazine rather than a newspaper. As it turned out, we wound up with both of them, Stars and Stripes as a daily paper and Yank as a weekly magazine. What they had in mind was, you're going to have something that can be circulated around the world, and you can't do that with a daily paper. So it worked out. We had we had 21 subsidiary printing plants around the world in 17 countries, and we had a staff of only 140 men. We were organized just as an Army company. What was decided was, it was decided by Franklin D. Roosevelt and George Marshall and Secretary of War Stimson, that we needed a publication for enlisted men talking to enlisted men. So we had to all be, we could not be any higher than rank of sergeant. Some of us got commissions and were instantly thrown off Yank. But inside Yank, we had the best job in the armed forces because we had a first sergeant in charge of us back on 42nd Street in Manhattan, and the 140 of us was spread right around the globe. In my own case, I was sent out to the Pacific as a corporal, 2 stripes, with 6 million square miles of blue ocean in which I was free to travel as I pleased. If I didn't like a command that I was in, I just left it. That was a dream. No corporal could do that. But we were very honest. We covered the war with brutal honesty. There was no propaganda. When it was awful, we told it the way it was. And so we had credibility. We also decided that you can't have a free handout because nobody reads a government handout. So we charged the soldiers 5 cents, which was 1/3 of what you would have to pay for the magazines of that time, Saturday Evening Pope or Collier's. And because they paid 5 cents, they read it and shared it. The one exception was that the fellows in combat got yanked free along with their rations. We had our share of Purple Hearts. Half of them were posthumous. The other half, of which I was one, fortunately were not posthumous, even though in my own case, I still have some of that Japanese mortar wandering around inside. In New York, where I was a reporter just before the war, one of the stories was we sold off the 3rd Avenue L. All that nice metal went out to Japan. It was a good way to get money out of scrap, but it also gave them plenty of material to put in their knee mortars. So I feel myself that I wrote a lot on the 3rd Avenue L, and now the 3rd Avenue L is writing on me. I've asked my sons and my grandchildren to pass out to you copies of the story of Yank. When he was 90 years old, my commander-in-chief, Colonel Forsberg, said to me, "You've got to tell the story of Yank." So I wrote the story, and anybody who uses these gets a discount because it will be actually out in October. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was a free commercial, as you can see, and I hope you buy a lot of these books. Now, let me ask you a question. You didn't have any officers in this organization, is that right?
Well, we did have officers, but only for administrative personnel. They would see to it that we stayed in the Army, but the editorial control, everything that went into the magazine was our own choice as privates, PFCs, corporals, and sergeants. Something unthinkable in military history. In fact, chain of command generals like MacArthur and Patton, both of whom were brilliant statisticians, neither of whom could ever understand Yank. How is it possible to allow the #1 morale instrument in the hands of enlisted men? But one reason why it worked was all of us on the staff really believed in the war. The nation had been attacked and we had to defend ourselves, so we were not seditious, luckily. And for that reason, Yank survived.
Yeah, but with Franklin Roosevelt and General Marshall for you, could you tell an officer to go to hell and get away with it?
We told them to go to hell in a nice way. We had cartoons in every issue. We started off making fun of second lieutenants and gradually got more courage until toward the end we were making fun of 2-star major generals, but only in cartoons. On one case, I do remember, I arrived out in Bougainville, where eventually I got shot, and my first thought was, begin telling the story of the soldiers here. And the Major General in command of the division sent a sergeant down to see me, and he said, the general is taking a Jeep up to the front lines tomorrow, and he's got space in the Jeep. He doesn't care one way or the other, but if you want to ride with him, you know, you can get back in the Jeep. I thought that was not a very insisting invitation. And so I said, well, thanks. My artist who accompanies me needs to build an easel so he can do his paintings. And anyway, our job, you know, is not to hang around with generals. Our job is to listen, men, but thanks just the same. Later on, I learned out that corporals never say that to major generals. And we were then dismayed because we found out that also in the Jeep was Lieutenant Colonel Gene Tunney, who had been the heavyweight champion of the world. He was the one who took the heavyweight championship away from the Manassas Mauler, Jack Dempsey. He was also in the Jeep, and both Bob and I were great boxing fans, and we missed the chance to have a day with Gene Tunney. Later on, after we left Bougainville, I got a letter from the general. He wasn't mad at us anymore, but he was fascinated that our stories were being published all over the world, and nobody was hearing about his division. So he said, please come back to my division. But we were scattered over the thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. We couldn't make it.
All right, now, would it be all right if we asked the colonel over here from the officer's standpoint what he thinks about this?
About this event here? Well, let me say that I'm proud to be an American when I walk through the World War II. I am also lucky to have served my country during that period. And what I want to remember about this is the 16 million comrades of mine, 400,000 who unfortunately can't be here today, and I think we all owe them a vote of thanks. So that's my feeling about the World War II Memorial.
Well, Sandra, would you like to ask some questions?
In today's age of embedded journalists, of 24-hour cable channels, tell me how you view the journalists and how they're covering the wars, the conflicts of today. And if you could talk to the correspondents out there, the war correspondents, what would you impart to them? What knowledge, what experience, what advice?
Can you hear me all right? That's a very, very good question. As you know, I was editor-in-chief of Stars and Stripes in the Pacific during the Vietnam conflict. And I think what we have to do, I'll give you an example. Last week in the Washington Post, page 1, a good journalist's lead story is always on the right, on page 1. And the lead story was about the investigation of the prisoner conflict, you know, in Iraq. So that disturbed me a little bit because the President of the United States had just that very day visited the Pentagon and reaffirmed that he was not going to do anything to the Secretary of Defense, but was going to keep him on. I felt that was the lead story. So I went down to the library and looked at the New York Times, and I was correct. I went and looked at the Washington Times. I was correct. I looked at USA Today, and I was correct. And I told the Washington Post, you need to go back to journalism school.
Thanks very much, Colonel.
Well, we'll have you answer the question, and then I'll introduce our new panel member.
Something like Yank magazine can never be repeated. Now in a time of instant communications, that's much faster than we were managed to do even with our printing plants around the world. Yank was unique. May its memory survive.
And joining us now, we've got Jack Polwers. Thank you very much for being here. We really do appreciate it. We were speaking earlier about how important it is that you tell your story and that we're able to record your stories. Jack is a man of great academic tradition, having earned degrees from Louisiana State University, Catholic University, and the Air War College. He served his country as an infantryman during World War II and followed his military service with a distinguished career as a news, radio, and broadcast journalist. He has headed departments of history and journalism at the Institute of Art and Design in Brooklyn, New York, Washington Hall College, and the Penn Media Center in Washington, D.C. He was a co-founder of the Department of Journalism when serving as an associate professor at Bowie State University in Maryland. He's regarded as an expert in World War II history and military journalism and has been an advisor to several TV networks and special documentaries. Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you for such kind words. Thank you. Let me tell you something. If you thought World War II was a total war, you ought to go out there in that traffic right now. Believe me. Okay. I put down a few notes that I'd like to read to you, because it's all excerpted from my book, which is called The Press of Battle, the GI Reporter, and the American People. And I want to tell you a little bit about the book, because that's a little bit about what World War II's writing, fighting, and citing is all about. I call it that. It's the photographers and the writers and the artists, wonderful people, all scrounging for the same thing, to get news back home to the people. And you had 845 pages in this book with about 400 interviews and 350 photographs. I can't tell you, it was a real struggle getting that book going. For 30 years, my wife, who is in the audience right now, would you stand up, sweetheart? You're the best, because believe me, she fought World War II. That's Florence. And to the great people who are on this panel with me, I am honored, and I consider it a privilege to be with you all. And thank you for coming and enjoying this wonderful day together. The Press of Battle has a chronology of the development of the press between 1900 and 1946, contains a history of Stars and Stripes from World War I to World War II, Yank, Army Weekly, the great Navy magazine All Hands, and the Coast Guard news service, The Clipper, started by the first Coast Guard combat correspondent. Guess who that was? None other than Alex Haley, the author of Roots. He was in there too. And the Marine Corps Gazette and the famous Leatherneck. The Press of Battle outlines the history of the camp newspapers of World War I and II, tells the story of Harry Craft, among hundreds of others who developed radio stations in Alaska, part of the Armed Forces Radio Network, and a newspaper called the Kodiak Bear. Now, he smeared bear grease on the front page of his newspapers to get the genuine smell of the Alaskan North. His captain thought that stunk so bad that he cut out the bear grease altogether and read down Harry Craft. The development of all the service-related newspapers and magazines from the 1800s on to 1946 is in the Press of Battle. The Press of Battle contains a one-of-a-kind list of the accredited reporters of World War II, and a list of those reporters, photographers, and newsmen who fell in battle, and there were many of them. Barrett, you're on that list too. The book tells the story about the continuity between World War I and World War II, and talks about the greatest artists such as Howard Brody of Yank, George Baker of Sad Sack fame, and of course Bill Malden, the inevitable great cartoonist. This was a strange phenomena unheard of in any war before. The enlisted man had taken over the newspapers and the news. They were all enlisted men, great photographers such as William Steichen and Jeff Corey of the Navy, and of course Slim Aarons of Yank, whom Barrett talks about. The first of its kind in a service magazine. Who ever heard of that before World War II? Yank was a great, great publication for that. And the top newsmen and women everywhere joined in the services. They were drafted or enlisted. They all wore the uniform and were trained for combat, and all were embedded. They explained to Americans and to the world about the war and what it was all about. And this was the first unheard of before. They created then the great motion picture series. How many heard of Why We Fight, the series with Frank Capra, producer? And leading the way, they created the Armed Forces Radio, the target largest radio network in the world, 360 stations worldwide, carrying the voice of lovely G.I. Jill. Her name was Jill Werner, a friend of mine, settled in Hawaii after the war. She got 2,000 letters a day, and she was the sweet woman's voice for the guys, reminding them of the girl back home and defeating Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose. How many heard of those people? You betcha. Profile news-hungry troops and sailors. The answer? Unheard of in history. The great Stars and Stripes newspapers, the Yank magazine and the All Hands, the magazine of the sailor, and Marine combat correspondents known as Denig's Demons, the best newsmen in the nation who went out to fight and put their lives on the line. They all wore the uniform, and all were in the war for the duration. They were children of the Great Depression. And as Bill Malden, the marvelous cartoonist and editor of Stars and Stripes, told me, he said, we came up in the school of hard knocks, and they knew it, and they knew how it was to be hungry. In this case, they were treating the people food, news. They were hungry for news wherever they went. The Press of Battle points out how the American people and the troops that fought the war were hungry for news as never in history before or since. This hunger for news in a total war and in the darkest hours of our country's history created the need for Stars and Stripes, read everywhere in 32 editions around the world, reaching 3 million circulation at the height of the war, and they were inspired by the greats of the journalism profession, by the way. The first Army press officer in 1916, guess who that was? General Douglas MacArthur. He was a colonel at that time, who, like General Black Jack Pershing, headed the American Expeditionary Force of World War I. Both Eisenhower and MacArthur regarded the Stars and Stripes as their papers. Profile, telling the truth in news. Did they create news stories and tell the truth about the news? My book, The Press of Battle, tells for the first time the fact that the Army had a news policy. For the first time in history of any military establishment anywhere in the world, military policy was to tell it like it is. In other words, for the first time, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines and Coast Guard had a news policy. What's more, the Stars and Stripes created that policy in World War I, and it went on through World War II.
Hey, Jack, can I interrupt just a minute? Because we're going to have to get some questions from the audience.
Sure.
You're pretty close to the end here.
Okay, I'm getting right to the end. Let me read the last paragraph here. There was the great invasion of Normandy. Stripes was there. Sergeant Hofeller of Stripes scaled the cliffs on gliders. Andy Rooney of Stars and Stripes went over with the bombers. And that persuasive reporter for UP, Walter Cronkite, went over with the bombers. On the Pacific side, there was young Johnny Buscemi of Yank, who lost his life taking pictures for Yank magazine in Eniwetok. The men of Stripes and all the rest of the men and women, and black reporters too, and women reporters, put their lives on the line, all knew why they were there, and our country is forever grateful to them all. They died for us so that we could live another day in freedom, that we're all carried in the Press of Battle. Thank you.
That's terrific, Jack. Thanks very much. Let's give Jack a hand. Now, Sandra, is it all right if I do this? Can I ask one question? And then I'd like to come out into the audience. I'll just hand the mic to you, whoever has a question. But the question I'd like to ask the panel is, first of all, what was the single most underreported story of World War II?
Well, I thought as a correspondent in the Pacific that I would try to sample every kind of combat. So I rode with the PT boats. I flew with the artillery spotters. I went out with finding the troops that had gone into the interior as advanced troops. But and I traveled with the destroyers, with the LSTs, the landing ship tanks, and also with the cruisers. But the one I always wanted to do and never could do was the heroic story of the submarines. That remained the greatest lost story of the war. Men who risked their lives, died deep in the ocean, and sank a large part of the Japanese fleet. That's the lost story of the war.
There are many, so many that I won't take your time, but I gave you one that about Antwerp X as I started. That's an unreported story, and it was really lost because the end of the war was coming. We were capturing Berlin, et cetera, et cetera. But there are many of them, many.
The greatest story of World War II, I think, was the time when the great merchant marine of America gathered their forces together, as small as they were, and escorted those the outdated destroyers to England to help them win the war. And they lost so many men, and they sunk the ships, but they carried on. The story of the merchant marine is one fantastic story, and it's still unheard of. I think they deserve credit.
Okay, Sandra, we got Basil over here. He wants to ask a question of Jack.
Jack, did you know Mac Morris and Howard Brody, who wrote for Yank magazine?
Yes, I did. I knew Howard Brody very well, and he was spectacular. One of the great sketch artists of all time. He later went to CBS News, by the way, to draw portraits of inside the courtroom where they couldn't get reporters in and photographers.
I spent an entire day posing for him in our B-17, which appeared in Yank magazine. He did our tail gunner, and he did me. I was a side gunner, radio operator and side gunner, and we posed there for the entire hot tropic afternoon while he drew us, and it appeared in Yank magazine.
Terrific, terrific.
Howard Brody was a close friend of mine, and still is. He lives out in California now. He had a brilliant career after the war as Jack had just mentioned, as a courtroom artist. During the war, Bill Malden, the famous cartoonist of the war, tells a story that he met Howard Brody crossing one of the rivers in Italy, and it got a little too hot for comfort, so Malden thought his best contribution to the war was to stay alive and keep doing the cartoon of Willie and Joe, so he turned around and went back. That was the last he saw of Howard until they finally got across the river. He crossed it, and there was Howard on the other side. He had just stayed with the front line and gone through to the other side. He was a man of immense sensitivity. He wept as he did some of his sketches of ruined soldiers. At one point, the editor of the Paris edition of Yank said that he wanted to do an editorial saying, "You've got to fight the enemy. If you see even one of the women, even the pregnant German women, kick them in the stomach." Howard went to him and said, "You know, we are a democracy on this publication. I forbid you to write that editorial," and it was suppressed. Howard Brody was one of our greatest.
There's another untold story of World War II that I didn't tell you about. I would like to introduce to you my sweetheart, college sweetheart, best friend, and my wife of 62 years, believe it or not. Wanda? Is there any other questions?
Yes, this question for Barrett. Barrett, will you tell us something about the people on Yank who were killed during the war? I was thinking, for example, of Johnny Buscemi, who was a friend of mine, killed at Tarawa. Oh, Barrett, I was asking you to tell us about some of the correspondents, Yank people in particular,
I could name a couple of those.
who lost their lives during the war. I was thinking particularly of Johnny Buscemi, with whom I served at Fort Bragg on the local paper before he was killed at Tarawa.
I can answer
two
part
of
of
our
that
greatest
question. Hold on,
losses
Barrett.
Yank magazine were two of our photographers, Johnny Buscemi and Pete Paris. And the curious thing about Yank was we got on there in the beginnings, many of us draftees, some of us volunteers, and Yank became so important to us that it totally absorbed us. And in the case of Johnny Buscemi, he was killed by a knee mortar out in the Pacific. And the last words he said, it sounds like something out of a B movie, was, "Be sure you get my copy back to Yank." In the case of Pete Paris, he was in the invasion of Normandy, and unhappily he took a direct hit. One of his legs was blown off. So he was scooped up, a medic stayed with him, and the medic said to him, what was your unit? He said it was Yank magazine. The medic said, "You said Yank magazine, what's that?" Pete went crazy. He forgot all about his leg. He said, "Yank, you should know about it. It's a great magazine."
Okay. Now
It was
Jack
a
has got to say
calculation.
something now.
He had just done that to distract him. They got him on a ship, and the ship was sunk, so Pete was hit twice, and that was the last of Pete.
All right, go ahead, Jack.
Barrett, I want to cut in just for a minute here. To correct the gentleman, by the way, he was not killed in Tarawa. He was killed on the island of Eniwetok, and that was Johnny Buscemi. And there were many other, of course. I think we ought to give credit where credit is due. There were Stars and Stripes reporters who were killed, and there were about 15 or 20 Marine veteran combat correspondents of the Marine Combat Correspondence Corps that were also killed on the various Pacific islands. And they gave their lives just like anyone else. And I think they all deserve credit. These are the fallen of World War II that we honor today. And I'd like to take just about 30 seconds just for silence to bow our heads and remember those who died, reporters all, in World War II. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jack. Okay, Sandra. What do you got? Anybody else out there got a question? There you are.
Hi, you mentioned some of the underreported stories. Can you give us some feedback maybe about some of the censored stories or stories that maybe information was withheld about during World War II that might have had a significant impact one way or another?
That's a very good question. I gave you one that was not reported till much later because of the operation. There were several others, to my knowledge, especially during the Battle of the Bulge, that were not reported because that was a very, very difficult time. I cannot give you specifics. I don't remember them, but it's an excellent. Many of them were not reported, but most of them because of security and secrecy, and correctly so. I don't think the story of when General Eisenhower moved from London to Rennes was ever reported for a long time, when SHAPE headquarters moved. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, in the end of World War II, to answer your question also, General Eisenhower put out an embargo among all of the press, saying that you cannot in any way, shape, or form broadcast the surrender of the Germans. Because what he wanted to do is let the Russians come in first, his friend, you know, and so forth, Marshal Zhukov, and they took over and so forth and so on. Well, what happened was Associated Press, a reporter, decided that he was going to break the embargo, and he was going to tell the story anyway. And he did, and that made Eisenhower furious, and they kicked him right out of the theater. And so the guy from Associated Press was no more in the European theater of operation. I thought I'd tell you that. And one more unreported story, and I'm going to keep quiet for a while. There was a great assembly of the press and photographers and writers and women reporters, and they were told at the foot of the mountain there to keep quiet because there are going to be something very big happening. And there's this great big wall called the Siegfried Line that Hitler said was impenetrable. Well, the U.S. Army penetrated it all right, and so did the English Army. And suddenly a big black car rolled up, and outside that car, after the photographers were told to stop taking the pictures and the newsmen were stop writing and everything else, out of the car came Winston Churchill and Field Marshal Montgomery. And up to the top of the big Siegfried Line wall they went. And they unzipped their pants and they peed on the Siegfried Line. That was an untold story of World War II.
I don't know whether that would have won the war, but I would say that the atrocities committed in the Pacific probably were underestimated. When I was in the second day going into Leyte with MacArthur when he returned to the Philippines, and the Filipinos told me about American pilots finally managed to get their planes onto the ground, and then the samurai swords being raised to decapitate them. Incidentally, I wanted to thank my two colleagues here for introducing their wives. My wife is not married for 60 years, but she has been married for 42. Jenny, take a bow.
All right, we've got time for one more question. Aren't you going to be a little biased in your question?
I'm not. Tell me, is there a comparable magazine in the military? Is there a comparable magazine in the military today to Yank magazine?
I'm not sure I
Is there a comparable magazine in today's military that's comparable to Yank magazine?
No, there is not.
Yank
no.
magazine, in the last week of 45, the War Department said, Yank is honorably discharged. There is nothing available for you to write about now, so you're finished. But
Well,
if
there
you
was
will
one.
notice these cards that my children and grandchildren are passing out, this is one of the covers of Yank magazine, which we're also using as the jacket on the story of Yank, which my old commander told me to write. Those you can see over on the side table here.
I'll say that there is no comparison today with anything that was published in World War II, generally like the Stars and Stripes and the Yank magazine. However, today we have a sophisticated Army magazine called Soldier, which is very good. Stars and Stripes is still producing great news. They're in Iraq today, and they're all over the world, and they are doing a superb job. So I think it's 50-50. Some of it is excellent, and some of it is not so excellent. But I'll tell you one thing, we all had a great time in World War II, and we're darn glad we got out of it, too.
How many veterans here remember the Overseas Weekly? Nobody. We used to call it the Oversexed Weekly. And that was That was during the Korean and the Vietnam Wars, and it went out of business because I think the military put it out of business.
Okay, Sandra, come on up here. This is our star. This is the lady who really knows what's happening in Stars and Stripes. So I want to thank Sandra, and I want to thank Jack and Barrett and Peter. Let's give them a great hand.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.